Tzoharaim Tovim, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome back. For those, there are a couple of people who weren't here the last week or so, so welcome back to you guys. For those, there's a couple here who I don't know if we've learned with you since I've been here. So welcome to you. Period. No, not back. Welcome, period. Glad y'all are joining us. And for those watching after the fact on YouTube, welcome back. Welcome. I don't know which one it is for you, so take whichever one is appropriate for your greeting for you. We're glad y'all are here and here to learn together. Hope everybody's doing well. Hope everybody had a good week, and everybody's ready to do some learning together. I am hoping, this is my goal for this week. This week's class will hopefully be very thought-provoking and hopefully won't anger anybody. That's my goal. So,
when you start that way,
you've been forewarned.
Trigger warning.
Don't say I didn't warn you. I actually did teach this one other time, but I think most of you weren't here for that. So those couple of you that were here the one other time I taught this, I think it'll be good for you to hear and learn with other people as well. So let me get the screen up, or the source sheet up for you guys. Here we are. Welcome to the Chuotchen, Reb Gedalia Rabinovitz of Linitz. Reb Gedalia is an interesting and important figure in Hasidic thought. If for no other reason, then there's a well-known Hasidic book called Shivchei HaBesht, which translates to like in praise of the Baal Shem Tov, and includes a collection of stories and anecdotes about the Baal Shem Tov, largely recollected by Reb Gedalia, who was one of his students and also a student of Reb Dov Ber of Mezrich, the Maggid of Mezrich, before he went out to start his own community. For those who are coming on Shabbat this week, you'll hear me talk about how this is the second of 4 special Shabbats that we have. Starting from Rosh Chodesh Adar through Pesach. The first one, let's just kind of review. The first one is, anybody know? Shabbat Shkalim, in which we read from Parashat Kitisa, which talks about how you're supposed to give every male is supposed to give a half shekel towards the temple. It becomes both a way in the wilderness, it became a way of them being able to census, but it also, all the proceeds went towards maintenance of the temple in ancient times. So it was also a little bit of a tax, but also a way of making the census. We'll get back to the second one in a moment. The third one is Shabbat Para, in which we read the ever profound and section of the red heifer, which sparks all sorts of fun commentary. I had a phone call from somebody who is like really into the red heifer and is like really trying to talk about, like, really interested in the building of the third temple and the red heifer and what that means. And I'm like, means that there's red cows out there, but the temple ain't built yet, so it doesn't really mean anything. Tried to tell him that. He didn't like that answer very much. And the fourth one is Shabbat HaChodesh, which is read before Rosh Chodesh Nisan, which 2 weeks before Passover, which kind of gets you in the mood for Passover. And then you have the fifth one is a little not quite as special, Shabbat HaGadol, which is the Shabbat before Passover. But this one is Shabbat Zachor, which is always read the Shabbat before Purim, in which we read this section that I'll have somebody volunteer to read from the book of Deuteronomy. somebody wants to read it for us.
I will start if you'd like.
Why not? Take it away.
Okay. Remember what Amalek did to you on the way when you came out from Egypt, when they came upon you on the way and you were tired and exhausted and did not fear God. When Hashem gives you rest, blot out the memory of Amalek from beneath the heavens. Do not forget.
Great. Comments, thoughts before I launch? I thought I'd give you guys a chance to comment. So anybody recall what happened with Amalek and the Amalekites?
When they were on their way wandering through the desert, they attacked from behind and attacked the weakest.
Good. So if you go back a couple parshiot, if you go back to Parashat Bishalach, which we read about a month ago now, after the Sea of Reeds, the Israelites say, great, we're free from Egypt. But man, are we thirsty? What are we supposed to do now? And then Moses gets them some water. And then they're like, man, that water was good, but now we're realizing we're kind of hungry. So, God provides them with manna and all the rules about the manna. But then you have this interesting scene where the Amalekites wage war on the Israelites. And there's a somewhat well-known scene in which Moses is not part of the battle. He goes up on a rock, and whenever he lifts his arms up, the Israelites start to win. But once his arms start to descend, then the Amalekites start to win. And then he raises his arms up and Israel starts to win. It goes back and forth until finally a couple people get smart and they prop his arms up. They get some rocks and prop his arms up, so his arms are up the whole time. And then Israel defeats the Amalekites. And from there, God condemns and criticizes the Amalekites there. But it's not until we get to these three verses in Deuteronomy that we really find out why they condemn. Like, lots of people fought the Israelites. It wasn't like they were the only ones. So what's so bad about Amalek that they get condemned as brutally as they do?
Because
and
they
as Tammy said, in these verses, which I didn't give you all the verses just because it gets kind of long, part of what the criticism seems to be is that the Amalekites snuck up on the Israelites and they attacked them from behind. And typically in herd, if anybody watches National Geographic, who's in the back of the herd?
The women and children.
the wounded, the old ones.
Children.
Good. The children who can't keep up as easily, often their mothers who are staying back with the children, but also the wounded, the ill, the elderly, those who aren't at the front. And so part of what commentators pick up from this is that was part of the condemnation, is that the Amalekites went after the weak rather than, a frontal attack and trying to really attack the Israelites. They tried to pick off the weakest from behind them. We're not going to get into it today. There is an odd phrasing in this verse, though, that you are supposed to blot out the memory of Amalek. Don't forget. This is an interesting paradox to which nobody exactly has an answer. Because if you blot out the memory, then there's no memory of them. But if you don't forget them, then you can't blot out the memory. So this becomes a long rabbinic conversation, which we're not going to get into. I just want to point out the contradiction there between don't forget to blot out the memory, because if you kind of can't logically do that, poses a problem.
Okay, well, I'm out of gas. I wouldn't go on that errands because I was scared.
Other questions, comments, thoughts?
Well, I would just say, I mean, I don't think it's relevant necessarily to what you're discussing, but I think having selective memory or the ability to really not let something bad that happened to you get deep inside of you, reflected, deflected. I think it can be psychologically a healthy way to handle things. But it gets more complicated than that from a side. Maybe others, maybe Margaret can tell us more about it. And I don't know that that's what is being said here, but I think that it is healthy not to let things get too deep into you and in that essence, forget some of what happened.
Psychologically, I 100% agree with you. Psychologists can probably talk a lot more and a lot better and more eloquently about, trauma and the effects of trauma and how you can't forget the trauma, but you don't want to control your life. So yes, there might be some of that as well. I think the phrasing of the Torah is a little awkward. I think that's I think all I'm trying to point out is that, it's one thing to move past the trauma and to not let it control your life, though it's still a part of you. It's another to say blot it out and don't forget to blot it out.
Well, could it not mean kind of blotted out for other people, make him less important, Amalek less important for other people, but the Jews need to remember that there is, so Amalek is not celebrated in some way by other people, but the Jews need to remember that there's always that threat at the back of the pack.
Maybe
I was
I
kind of thinking on the same lines as Margaret, is that, that saying, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. It's like, don't forget to watch out for your back, but yet don't, like Stuart says, don't let the pain of that destroy you. Let the pain go, but remember the lesson that you learned.
Right. I think part of the challenge is that why do we read this section on the Shabbat before Purim?
Yeah.
Is it because of, I'm thinking of the connection with Haman, maybe?
Yeah.
Ooh. Sorry.
Wanting to
Um,
to destroy.
Good. So
As
actually
a
the Haftarah this
manifestation
week,
of Amalek, is that what you mean, Tammy?
yeah. So
kind
let
of
me connect the dots a little bit for you guys, for those who might not know. The Haftarah for this week it comes from the first book of Samuel. And shortly after the first king of Israel is, can't think of, what do you do for the kings? I don't say inaugurated. What's the word for kings?
Crowned?
Crowned? Sure.
Anoint.
Anointed. I think anointed is what I was thinking of. But crowned works also. Shortly after, King Saul is anointed as the first king of Israel, of all of the 12 tribes. He is given a mission. So I just had to pick the Jake and Elwood Blues. We're on a mission from God. Any Blues Brothers fans in here? He's sent on a mission from God to destroy Amalek. And he is commanded to utterly wipe out the Amalekites that are on the border, and to not take anybody hostage, to not let any of the cattle or anything come back with them. King Saul goes to battle against the Amalekites. defeats them. Yay. But decides to take the cattle as loot, and also, instead of killing him, takes as captive King Agag of Amalek, who was the monarch at the time. Samuel the prophet, who had been the one who sent Saul on this mission, roundly condemns him and tells him that the throne is going to be taken away from him and given to someone more deserving because he didn't follow directions. By the way, who gets the throne from Saul?
David.
Good. David ends up getting the throne next. Fast forward about 700 years, we get to the book of Esther, where King Ahasuerus decides to appoint his new vizier, his new second in command, and he anoints
Haman.
boo. This is where everybody boos. Get in the mood. Who is known as an Agagite. He is described in the book of Esther as an Agagite, as in descended from King Agag, the king of Amalek. As a side note, anybody know which tribe King Saul came from?
Benjamin.
He was a Benjaminite, as, by the way, is Mordecai.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Mordecai is also traced back to Benjamin, which means this is a lot more than a, Mordecai doesn't like Haman.
Who?
Thank you.
This is like the Hatfields and the McCoys.
This is right. This is 600 years plus of animosity and family feuding and communal feuding, going all the way back to even before those 600 years to the Exodus from Egypt. So this is like 1,000 years of animosity between their people, of which Mordecai and Haman just become kind of the leaders of in this story. After Haman, okay, you guys are muted. I'll cut you
Boo,
some.
boo, boo.
You got to get in practice for this. Quorum's coming up quick.
We need
I need the little grogger thingy.
Just take your table efforts too. Boo. It's fine. After him, and actually generally after Rome, pretty much all of the great enemies of the Jewish people get attributed as Amalekites. So the Crusaders, Amalekites. The Spanish Inquisition, Amalekites. Also Asav, but Hitler, definitely an Amalekite. So you get throughout Jewish history it's kind of this thing of like Amalek has become kind of this personification and symbol of evil and hatred and that is in the world. So in some level, yes, we are supposed to blot it out, but we're not there yet, and we haven't actually completed the task. Though some commentators basically say that Saul could have completed the task, and his failure to do so has now caused all this misery down for centuries and millennia afterwards. But I'm not going to go that harsh on poor King Saul. He had enough troubles. He doesn't need us piling it on him.
So is the Torah trying to teach us that that Amalek, this degree of evil was really a high level, we should blot it out? Where do we start not blotting things out? Where can we try to remember and not forget?
I'm not sure I understand.
Well, so many evil things have happened to the Jews throughout the millennia.
Yeah.
Are we supposed to blot them out of our memory, or what kind of things are we supposed to?
No, I think you're supposed to blot out not the memory of what they've done, but more blot out the people who are doing it. So it's more of an accusation against the people and blotting out. And I think this is the way a lot of commentators read this, is that part of our job is to eradicate Amalek from this world. Much as Saul was commanded to do and failed to do, now it's become our job to make that eradication. That doesn't mean we forget the suffering that Amalek has caused. It means we create a world that no longer knows what Amalek is and doesn't recall him. So that in other words, once you can wipe out all evil from the world, people will forget that evil ever existed. Awfully idealistic, but that's the goal. Other questions, comments, thoughts? Now, of course, as we've said, we say frequently in this class, Reb Gedalia is not going to read this as Amalek and isn't even going to read this as the personification of evil. He's going to read this in a much more spiritual term and as a spiritual battle that is going on. So let's take it from there. Somebody want to continue reading?
I'll read.
Please.
The phrase came upon you is not clear. Neither is the repetition of do not forget. After the Torah already said, remember. Also, how do we fulfill the mitzvah of blotting out Amalek today?
Great. So he's, as the Hasidic rebbes often do, that he's starting off with the question. We have the verse that he's going to drash. He's going to ask some questions and then he'll answer his questions. So he actually has three questions here. What are his questions?
So
Uh,
what do
the
we mean by
phrase-
came upon you? Why do we repeat do not forget after saying remember? And how do you fulfill the mitzvah?
Good. So he says this phrase karchecha that's translated as came upon you. That's a weird phrase. What does that actually mean? So that's part one. Second question is, one of the principles of rabbinic thought is that every word and in fact every letter of the Torah is there on purpose. So why is it necessary for the Torah to say remember at the beginning and do not forget at the end? He actually doesn't even get into the blotting out the memory part. He's saying don't forget and remember mean the same thing. So why is it repeated twice? It has to be teaching us something else. And third, how do we fulfill this mitzvah of blotting out Amalek? What is that? How do we do that now? No, Amalek's not, there aren't a people called the Amalekites. So what are we supposed to do in our modern times? Sue, that was a short one. Why don't you read the next one too? Put you to work today.
It appears that on this topic, according to scientists, remembering and forgetting is dependent on if the temperament of a person is cold or warm. A cold temperament is more likely to forget, and a warm temperament is more likely to remember. I learned from the Rabbi Aryeh Leib from Palani, whatever, is the name of the Baal Shem Tov, that Amalek is another name for forgetting.
Okay. Questions, comments, thoughts?
A cold
This is a step. So, he hasn't actually this is a step in an argument. So he hasn't made any conclusions yet. He's kind of building his argument.
So is he saying like the temperament of a person is cold or warm? Is he talking about I would consider myself a warm temperament, meaning I get emotional about stuff. Is that what he's talking about?
Not 100% sure. I do know that. I'm trying to think of even when somebody who's more knowledgeable in the history of psychology might be able to answer this better than me. But this is how they used to define. Like, it wasn't just like your personality is warm and you're friendly and welcoming the way we usually define it, but that they defined temperaments in kind of these hot and cold terms.
Oh, that's,
And,
I mean, that's really, really ancient,
yes.
you know.
And it
and-
really only changed in what, the last 100, 200 years.
Yeah, there used to be like the humors.
Yes.
It was
So-
kind of Middle Ages through until almost till, as you say, a couple of 200 years ago or so.
Right. So I think that's more where he's going, is that there are certain personality characteristics
Mhm.
that fit into these personality types between warm and cold. Now I do imagine some of it lines up somewhat similarly. I apologize, this is not my area of expertise, but I do imagine that, warm personalities probably are more optimistic, friendly, talkative, I would guess probably more eloquent, things like that, whereas what we might call extroverted to some extent, whereas cold personalities were more reserved, introverted, quiet, and that was part of that group's kind of grouping of personalities.
Maybe like holding grudges, like holding a grudge. Cold,
Possibly I would imagine that would probably fall into the cold
right.
temperament more, but I'm also
I don't
I'm
think
somewhat taking an archetypal view of this. I don't know the exact characteristics, but I'm kind of taking like cold is probably more of the quiet, reserved type, and some of the more negative characteristics in an archetypal view, whereas warm is more of like the things that we would idealize more. What were you gonna say, Margaret?
Yeah, I think you're kind of thinking in a more modern terms,
Right.
specifically because the characteristics that you mentioned, and we can think of, easily think about warm people and cold people in those kinds of terms, doesn't relate to forgetting and remembering. And those are, that's a different sort of attribution than the things that we would usually say.
Correct.
In
So
terms.
yes, I'm kind of somewhat projecting modern views on, but yes, what I think the point of those, I think that there was a series of characteristics that would define somebody as a cold temperament and a series of characteristics that would characterize somebody as a warm temperament. And part of that characteristic, as he's teaching, is that a cold temperament is more likely to forget, whereas a warmer temperament is more likely to remember. That's really the goal of where he's going with it. And that if those personality traits fall within those particular circle of characteristics.
So the people like the more naive people in terms of these interpretations would want to say, well, is he saying it in two different ways because just emphasizing it to make it more important, or is there really a difference between the two? I mean, it's kind of like, remember, I once asked about the Shema when it says, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all the soul, and all thy might. That's a pretty strong statement. It doesn't seem like that needs repeating, but then he says, and you have to put this in your heart. I mean, there's a second sentence to even further. So I don't know whether it's just emphasizing how important that is, or is there a different meaning to the two?
What I think, look, I think what he's trying to do is remembering that he's talking largely to 18th century Ukrainians who were, and this is not a degradation, but they were not the most wealthy, educated people to be able to know a lot of like these kinds of things. So I think what he's trying to do is say, put it in words that they understand. They might not know this depth of Torah, but they might know about cold and warm temperaments. That's kind of knowledge, as Margaret said, it's been going on for like thousands of years, that they might actually be aware of. So what is he saying? He's saying, you know, this idea of cold and warm, with the cold temperament has a temperament of forgetting, and the warm has a temperament of remembering. There's also a reason he's doing that, because he's going to have a play on words, which we just haven't gotten to yet. But I think that's a little bit of what he's doing, is he's putting it into something that he's pretty sure that they would be aware of and that his people would know. Oh, we just lost somebody. Other questions before we go on?
Well, I think that maybe we should discuss, or you can say some more about the idea that Amalek is another name for forgetting. That seems to me
So maybe it might help if we go on. Let's go on.
Yeah, okay.
And that might help us go forward. Do you want to read the next one, Margaret, since you brought it up?
The Israelites had their hearts ignited when they saw how the Holy Blessing One performed wondrous miracles when they left Egypt, through striking down of the Egyptians, the splitting of the Sea of Reeds, and the 10 wondrous miracles, that is the plague, that was done for our ancestors. Over the sea, one of these miracles, a stone from the wall would cry out to praise and to thank and to sing out God's great name. But Amalek, the wicked, dressed these miracles in nature, cooling off the hearts of the Israelites from their faith. Thus they came to forget the Blessing One's acts of kindness.
Okay. So what's going on here?
So
So
is it saying that the Israelites, because of all of the wonders and things that they saw God do, their hearts were like on fire, full of him, but then Amalek made these miracles seem like it was not miracles. They were something that was natural, something that, you know, just happens. So it turned it, I mean, maybe I'm just taking it at first face value, but it turned their hearts away from God.
Good.
So maybe this is a criticism of the people at the time who wanted, the scientists at the time who wanted to make these out not to be miracles but to be scientific facts.
Good.
At the time of in the 18th century, which,
Well, yes, but not exclusively to such. But have you guys, we've talked about this before. Have you got any of you seen these shows about the 10 plagues? Once in a
Yes.
while, these shows will come up about the 10 plagues on like History Channel or National Geographic or any of these. And they'll say, well, how could this have happened?
Yeah.
Well, let me explain it to you. There was a volcanic eruption that happened, and the ashes from the volcano landed in Egypt, and it turned the Nile red, which is which made it look like blood. And then the ashes of the blood, the ashes came and changed the pH level of the Nile, which made all the frogs run out of that lived in the Nile run out of the Nile. And that caused this to happen, and this caused that to happen, and this is how the 10 plagues happened. Have you guys seen these shows? I think I've mentioned
Yes.
them before.
Yes.
What are they doing?
They're
I think they-
explaining away the miracles.
Yeah, here's a phenomenal miracle that happened. And what are we doing? We're saying it wasn't a miracle. It's just the way the world works.
Mhm.
It's
It-
just
good luck.
science. It's just science happening. It's science doing what science does. It's just explaining how the things happen.
Hmm.
And I think what Margaret's right. Like what he's saying like the Israelites who came out of Egypt, they saw these plagues happen. They saw God strike down the Egyptians. They saw the Sea of Reeds split open for them and them cross on dry land. And I think we talked about either last week or 2 weeks ago that, a handmaiden, the lowest social class there was, saw something that not even Isaiah and Ezekiel, who stood in God's throne room, were able to see. The miracle was so great, they saw God in action. There's a great midrash on Shirat Hayam, on the Song of the Sea. It says, Ze Eli ve'ambehu, and this is my God. And they say, like, Ze means something you can point to, which means that the Israelites crossing the sea could actually point and say, this is my God. I can see God right now. And they were full of faith from it. And what does Amalek do? Amalek says, not such a miracle. Wasn't that big of a deal. That happens every day. And he's playing off this word karchecha. So in Hebrew, cold is kar. Like if you say like, oh, I'm cold, it's karli. Like I'm cold. So he's saying like their hearts were inflamed with faith, and what it karcha means, they cooled them off. They cooled you off with their arguments. And the Israelites bought it. They came to forget the blessing one's acts of kindness. Questions, comments? In trying to prep for this class, I almost prepped something from the Eish Kodesh. I just ran out of time to actually get it all prepped. But he has a vicious criticism of this. And he says, like, these scientists and philosophers, they talk awfully nicely. They talk nicely, they argue nicely, they make it seem all so beautiful and thoughtful, but it's really not. They're really destroying your faith by doing it.
Yeah, there's a philosopher named Alvin Plantinga who I really like, who does a lot about faith and reason, and he put it very neatly one time to me that he, not personally in the book, he said that he pointed out that science has what's called methodologic naturalism. So the whole method of science is that everything happens by nature. So science is never going to say this happened by a miracle, because that's antithetical to science. And the problem that scientists and other people get into is thinking that it's true that everything is, quote, scientific and natural. It's really, it's a basic assumption of science, but it's an assumption. And it's not even a verifiable assumption. And people just forget that it's working assumption and think that it must be true. And therefore what science says, if science says there aren't miracles, it means something. It just means miracles aren't scientific, but it doesn't mean that science is a complete description of the world.
Beautiful. I took a philosophy of religion class in college. And the one takeaway I have from it is no matter what argument you make for the existence of God, there's a counter argument to it. And by the way, there's always a counter argument to the counter argument. But on the flip side, any argument you make against God's existence, there's a counter argument to it. And there's usually a counter argument to that counter argument. And so you ultimately can't, kind of as Joshua said, you can't come to you're working off an assumption that you can't actually prove. So if you're coming from a perspective of there is no God, well, nothing I say is ever going to convince you because you've already come to that assumption, whether or not there's evidence for it. And if you come from this place of there is a God, never going to convince you otherwise, no matter how little evidence how much evidence you bring, because you're working off assumptions which are unverifiable.
And one of the things I love so much about the Torah is that even the people who marched across the sea and had God thundering at them about here are the commandments, 20 days later, they're up to no good. Like, it's just, we really are weird animals and we're not going to do what we're supposed to do. And, imagine if God thundering at you is not going to convince you. Of course, a logical argument is not based on like weird assumptions is not going to convince anybody either in the last time.
But you know what, that's kind of like why I'm very much, Jonathan is a little bit more, I think, liberal in his theology than I am because of the ways we grew up. But I kind of like always point to that's the reason why I actually believe the Torah, because who would write such a book? Who would make their people so just crazy sometimes? Everything else you see, everybody is
one of the things I do find wonderful about it, and one of the first arguments, I was looking years ago, like, how can you take this stuff seriously? And one of them literally was, who else's foundation stories paint them in such a lousy light? Like everyone else, we were great and heroic and we were descended from gods and, we were noble and wonderful and we're being led out of Egypt and then we're complaining 2 days later.
Where's the chicken? Where's the fish? Where
are the garlic and leeks?
And the quail. I actually, I don't know if I've given this sermon here. I'm trying to remember, but I have given this sermon that I think that's one of the things that makes the Bible so enduring, is that you look at Greek mythology, for example, you get Hercules and you get Achilles and you get Helen and you get all these people who are always practically perfect except for one flaw, which inevitably becomes their downfall.
Fatal flaw, their fatal flaw.
Yes,
you're right.
Inevitably, there's a flaw that becomes their that kills them. But I'm still not convinced that an arrow to the heel is going to kill you. But we're just going to put that aside for the moment. Nor am I clear why she, like, after she dipped him from the heel, why she didn't just like
she
flip him
didn't
over
dip his other foot. I know, right?
I never figured that part out.
Lack of attention to detail.
There's this ideal of perfection in Greek mythology, which seeps into Greek philosophy also. But you read the Bible, ain't nobody here perfect. Like, everybody has their flaws and everybody does things that are not perfect. As much as the rabbis try to whitewash some of it, read it. If you just read the Parashat, if you just read the Torah in and of itself as a piece of literature, everybody's doing something wrong, like not infrequently. But I think that's also why it speaks to us, because we can be an Abraham, we can be a Moshe, we can be an Isaac, a Jacob, a David. We can achieve these levels because they're not perfect heroes that we're trying to aspire to be. They're inherently flawed, just like us.
They're
And I think-
flawed and they're beloved by God. So clearly you don't have to be perfect.
Even better, right?
Right.
They're flawed like us, and they are loved by God just as much as we are because of their flaws. And I think that is part of how the Bible, Christianity or not, I think that's part of how the Bible has endured, is because we've been able to, we can relate to these characters. And by the way, I said, like, Greek mythology, the perfection seeps into Greek philosophy. This inherent flawness seeps into Jewish philosophy too. And we're trying to understand things that we know we can't understand inherently, which is why we argue and debate and go back and forth and discuss, because we know we can't get to the answers, but we're going to keep trying anyway. All right, who wants to take it home? Finish us off.
I'll read that. This is, remember what Amalek did to you when they came upon you on the way. They tried to cool off and separate you from the boiling faith of the Holy Blessing One until you came to forget. Through this, you were tired and exhausted and did not fear God. You let your boiling faith rest like a tired and exhausted person and did not fear God to give thanks to remember the omnipresence acts of kindness. And this, when Hashem gives you rest, blot out the memory of Amalek from beneath the heavens. Do not believe that everything is entirely natural, and do not forget, so that you do not come again to forget this.
Good. Who wants to summarize for us?
Don't pay attention to people who want to make you not believe.
Good. To some extent, and this is the right-wing religious view of it, to some extent he's saying ignore science. Science is just trying to cool off your faith, tell you there is no miracle, that this is just part of the world, and that it'll cause you to put aside your faith. And you buy into it, you're going to be tired and exhausted because you're not going to have the faith to support you anymore.
Well, I'm taken by this in both the first paragraph and this one, that you're told do not fear God, but at the same time, you're told to remember your blessings from God. Seems to emphasize that.
Yeah, I think what he's saying is you lose your faith when you buy into it. But what you're supposed to do is remember what God has done for you and remember the miracles that God has performed.
It seems to me that even if all those things have a scientific explanation, that doesn't exclude the agency of God.
Say more? You say more about that?
Sure. I mean, it's entirely possible that, or arguable, that God could have caused these things to happen, caused the natural rules or workings or patterns of the world to act in a particular way at a particular time.
I totally agree with that because, like people say, like the Big Bang Theory. Well, who's to say he didn't cause the Big Bang? I'm not saying there wasn't a Big Bang, but who says he didn't do it? So I agree with you, Margaret.
If anybody ever gets really bored and wants to go deep diving, if you try to read the Zohar, the foundational book of Kabbalah, if you read the Zohar's opening midrash on Bereshit bara Elohim, the first couple words, what it kind of describes, which I find absolutely fascinating, and one of these days I'm going to have to do some research, I just haven't done it yet. What it describes is that in an innermost point, there becomes a spark of holiness, a spark of light from which all of everything else generates. So, like, from this spark, all of creation comes from this one little spark that God puts there, which, when you read it, it sounds an awful lot like the Big Bang Theory of all matter coming together and then into one spark and then blowing out. This is all things come into one, start from one spark and then flow out of it. So you get flow instead of an explosion. But it's a really kind of fascinating comparison, which comes to the similar place, right? Like, okay, did God etch this into the fabric of creation and then that's how the Big Bang happened? Or, did all matter come together and create an explosion? Or did God cause the matter to create all the explosion? Yes, you're coming to this place of you can't actually prove that God is not behind nature, which, by the way, is one of the key ideas of Purim too. God is not mentioned at all in the book of Esther, but if you read the book of Esther, you get this impression that everything falls into place in a particular way because God is kind of putting people in the right places at the right time to be able to have God's will play out.
I want to push back a little bit on the quote science things, though.
Please.
The
Please do.
descriptions of the miracles are very different from anything I've ever heard, quote, science propose for them, really. I mean, other than the locusts and the hail and the frogs, having the river run with blood is hard to describe. The darkness is really hard to pull off anywhere else. The splitting of the Red Sea with holding your arms up and having the Red Sea split and be able to walk across. I've never heard a really convincing scientific explanation for those, quote, scientific, unquote, unless they then rely on something that's an analogy to what was described. But, one thing that struck me reading the Talmud and things is, in the Talmud, there's this really detailed discussion of how bees make honey and whether they excrete the honey or regurgitate the pollen. And it's used to argue about whether it's kosher or not. And I'm like, these people were just as smart as we are and probably more observant about the natural world. So the fact that it's described one way and you have to bend it and twist it to make it even plausibly kind of naturalistic makes those explanations to me very unsatisfying. Which is not to say that God can't act in natural ways, but it doesn't, to me, sound very plausible that it would be just the earth doing its thing under God's distant guidance that would make the 10 plagues happen.
Rabbi Dorff has a similar story of which the Talmud says that when a woman is pregnant, the first 40 days of her pregnancy, it's considered like water. The fetus is considered like water. At 40 days, it's considered like a bone in her body. And Rabbi Dorff tells a story how he went to like a bioethics conference and went up to an OBGYN and said, like, I forgot what the guy had been talking about, but I was talking to him and said, what does a fetus look like at about 40 days after conception? He's like, oh, it looks like it's about this big and it looks kind of like shaped like a bone. And Rabbi Dorff is like, how could they have known that, right? Like, how could the rabbis have known that? He's like, it was just like mind-boggling, the science that they could figure out and that they knew without the technology to know it.
On the other hand, they're very careful to say that mushrooms are different because mushrooms, unlike other plants, don't get their nutrition from the ground, which was completely backwards.
They're not perfect, they're flawed,
no.
just like us.
Oh yeah, no, I'm just saying, but they were very careful observers of what they could observe. So if someone is going to seriously say all the water turned to blood, like they could tell the difference between blood and an influx of clayey runoff from somewhere else.
Algae, like that algae in China that's making the water pink or something.
Yeah, like
I heard
blood
that,
is definitely not red algae, and it's not a whole lot of clay silt in your water. It's blood, and blood is something that they would have been very acquainted with. I'm sorry, I interrupted you, Rabbi.
No, all good. Yes. So to your larger point that the science doesn't always have a convincing argument, but it's convinced of the fact that it's natural in the first place. And
well, I mean, I would say, see, I think that's actually a misuse of science. It's not scientific to go back and try to retrofit naturalism to stories of miracles, because there's no evidence, there's no way to experiment on it or do anything. It's extending science beyond its purview in a way that's harmful. And that's where I think when science does that, it makes people want to reject science, following your summary of this last paragraph of saying, well, if you follow science, you have to say that it goes against faith. Whereas you really can say science has its place, but trying to retrofit explanations for miraculous occurrences and make them naturalistic is not one of its places.
okay, so two things I'll kind of say in response, which is going back to your idea of, I forgot your exact expression, but of assumed naturalism, which assumes that if a miracle occurred, that has to have a naturalistic explanation. So from a scientist, now, I agree with you that it's bad science. But you can also see that if you're coming from this assumed naturalism position, you're going to want to connect and say, but if that, like, all things have a natural explanation, and how can we naturally explain it? I agree it's bad science because you can't, as you said, you can't verify it or experiment or anything like that. It doesn't mean people aren't doing it.
Yeah, there's a distinction between science and scientism. I guess this is sort of scientism.
Fair.
Seeing things as though it's science.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question of who is actually doing that.
Yeah.
But I think
Actually,
the larger point I want to make, which I think Joshua also kind of started to go to, is that we all, and Reb Gedalia kind of paints this as an either or as, in some sense, he's painting it as a spiritual battle, where science and faith are waging a spiritual war for your soul, so to speak. And that Amalek is the representative of science, whereas Hashem is the representative of faith. And I'm not sure that's necessarily in the way we should be viewing this. Rabbi Artson, like my teacher, Rabbi Brad Artson, has a great quote where, like, science should critique bad religion. And if you're saying things that are very obviously contradictory to science in the name of faith, science has a right to tell you that's just blatantly wrong. You want to say that the world was created 5,783 years ago from nothing and that people have been here since the sixth day of creation? We can pretty scientifically prove that that's false. That doesn't mean you can't believe in creation. That doesn't mean you shouldn't believe in creation. And it doesn't mean it doesn't have something to teach us spiritually. It just means factually it's incorrect. But at the same time, religion has the right and the obligation to critique bad science and to say, as Joshua said, you can you can say this happened by nature all you want. You have no way of actually verifying or proving that that's the case. And in some sense, what we should be striving for is not a science or religion, a science or faith perspective. I'm taking this down unless we need it again. We shouldn't be striving for an either or, but a way that the two can work in harmony with each other to help us understand and live our lives more deeply and meaningfully. That if our faith is so weak, if our faith is so weak that it can't take a scientific criticism, what does that say about our faith? And I think on some level, that's also the critique that Reb Gedalia says, is that Amalek is, who's Amalek picking off with the scientific arguments? He's picking off the weakest of our faith. But at the same time, what does religion do? Religion should try to take what we learn about science and turn it into a thread of how can we live a meaningful life? How can we take what science teaches us and help us find our place within this world? That's what religion should be doing. And science should be challenging us to further our knowledge so that we can continuously expand what that world looks like and figure out how we fit into it. The two do not have to be at war with each other, but can complement each other in our spiritual lives.
Rabbi, I'm sorry I was late, but my doctor's appointment ran over. But I don't really see a conflict. My faith in God is not shaken by science whatsoever. And I don't know if you've discussed Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan at all. He was a noted scientist and very much a Kabbalist and attached to his faith. So what we might see as science today, just like in the past, we didn't have the knowledge or the information that we now have today that is more clarifying. So many of the Kabbalists are quantum physics people, and they seem not to have an issue. I mean, like you
You're talking
said,
about modern Kabbalists?
yeah, like Daniel Matt, there's Arthur Green, there's quite a few that are well known, but even Aryeh Kaplan was just a fantastic scientist. And even, oh my gosh, it's just, I just don't see it. I don't see it. I think our knowledge is somewhat limited today, but who knows what our knowledge will be in the future. So what we saw as science 50 years ago, has really grown and clarified a lot of things since then. So even in the terms of DNA and RNA, and I'm 70. When I first started out, I was making my own aspirin. Okay, so things have changed.
Yes, and the one thing I will say is that who knows where we'll go in the future. Our knowledge will be greater than it is now, and it will still be limited. And there will always eternally be a point of knowledge that we're never going to be able to get past, because we are simply limited. We're limited beings, and as limited beings, we're only going to ever be able to attain limited knowledge.
Right. I mean, Einstein was a Kabbalist, and so was Tesla. So, you know, these people made tremendous inroads. So I think what we perceive and know today is not what we're going to perceive and know tomorrow. So
Correct.
I don't have conflict.
No, I think some people try to force there to be a conflict. There are some religions make a big deal out of asserting the literal truth of things that don't seem to be literally true, which then annoys the scientists. And then some scientists overreach and assert that things can't be true because what's written in the Bible doesn't sound plausible. And they, you know,
Correct.
I don't think there has to be any fundamental conflict, but people like to force there to be.
Yes, and I think we've been taught for a long time that there is a fundamental conflict. There's even even in rabbinical school we had this issue, in that one of our teachers is a biblical scholar, Dr. Zioni Zevet, has written extensively on the Bible and biblical criticism. He was also one of the advisors for Prince of Egypt. But he was also an Orthodox Jew. He went to Orthodox synagogue, and we never understood how he could be Orthodox and be a biblical critical scholar. But that the two don't have to be in conflict with each other if you can find a way to put the two together and have them reinforce each other in terms of your spirituality and your faith.
Mm-hmm. Biblical textual criticism is also sort of a fascinating one there, which it's an interesting framework to see things, but there's absolutely no way to verify that it's true because it extends things back beyond where there's evidence.
Correct.
So, if you take it at its face and believe the assertions it's true, then it challenges your faith in the Torah, but you don't have to believe those assertions. You can say that's a good way to look at it, but not necessarily the truth.
Yes. One of my eternal, from my time in academics, when I did do a lot in biblical critical scholarship, that was one of the things that always kind of rubbed me wrong about it. Was I'm like, this is all great and fascinating, can't prove it. It's a great theory, and that's why they call it the documentary hypothesis, or the progressive hypothesis, because that's all it can ever be, is a hypothesis. Unless we were to miraculously unearth archaeologically some documentation that seemed to show it, we really got no way to know it ever. Doesn't mean it's wrong, it just means we can't prove that it's right.
Yep.
So, all right. Kol hakavod, everybody. Thank you for learning together. Wishing everybody a Chag Purim Sameach, a happy Purim, and I hope to see y'all here celebrating with us on Monday night. And if I don't see you before then, Shabbat Shalom. And I'll see you guys next week. So take care, everybody. Be well.
Take care.
Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.